So, Jeffrey and Clayton are pioneers in the consciousness technology space and co founders of Focus Life Force Energy, otherwise known as FLFE, a breakthrough approach to activating high consciousness fields in homes and businesses worldwide. Blending engineering, consciousness, kinesiology, and decades of research on the psychology of human development, their work explores how environment directly impacts self esteem, resilience, and personal evolution. Their mission is simple: raise consciousness at scale. Disclaimer: any of the guidance offered by the podcast host, myself, or the podcast guests is our own guidance. We are not liable for any of the actions the podcast listener decides to do. Welcome to the show, Clayton and Jeffrey. Glad to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
Good to meet you, Johnny.
Awesome. So, I'd love to know. I mentioned a little bit about your mission being about raising consciousness on scale, and you've got this technology out there to really help people. Uh, Really big mission. So I kind of got a two-part question for you. So, first of all, what is consciousness for you? Maybe that was a bit of a big question to dive into, but also, where does this drive to help people raise their consciousness come from for both of you?
hmm Well, we see consciousness as underlying everything. I mean, from our point of view, and the pioneering people like Dr. Um, Gary Schwartz and others in the consciousness field, and is everything has some level of consciousness, and it is not in what we traditionally think of as in our brains, but there is consciousness in all forms everywhere, and you could say it underlies reality, and it is part of a larger consciousness that is all that is the universe. However you want to think about a higher power or higher consciousness, that we're all part of that, and in working with consciousness, we're measuring on a scale, the Dr. David Hawkins
Mm.
scale of consciousness. So we are calibrating that, so we're always measuring where we are on that scale.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, so I'll talk about consciousness from a personal point of view, which is the way most of us will relate to it. It's a quality of being. It's a degree of personal freedom. It's the absence, or a high consciousness anyway, would be the absence of obsessive thoughts, preoccupations, addictions. Um, I would say a a reduction and an experience of having more joy in life than suffering would be a high consciousness, right? And as Jeff said, consciousness fields, the conversation about consciousness fields, it's sort of like the elusive obvious. It's like talking to a fish about water. We all live in consciousness fields. We live in consciousness. We've been in it our whole lives. So what we're trying to do is, I guess, well, for myself, is be an advocate for the conversation about the fact that we live in these consciousness fields all the time, and how do they affect our personal evolution? How do we measure them? Those sort of things. So that's a little another perspective on it.
Mm.
And I would follow up on why rising consciousness. What's the point of that? Is Clayton touched on it? It's increasing freedom, is how we see it, and increasing freedom from patterns that we may have picked up in childhood, past traumas, things that we learned along the way that are really maybe at a lower level of consciousness, a lower emotional age, and being free of those patterns that were great at the time to help us cope with whatever was happening, but they now can be sort of that rubber band that pulls us back. Like, well, maybe I don't deserve that, or maybe I really can't do that. It didn't work out last time. So as we rise in consciousness, we become free of those old patterns. They start to rise. Those various parts of us that are, uh, you could say, inner children or uh, lower emotional age parts of ourselves start to rise naturally in a high consciousness field, and they start to heal and integrate into the whole that we are. And from that place, we can just be present with what is, and have increased power to create the life and the world that we want to see.
Do you think we, so from my, just to kind of understand, is it that we naturally have a high consciousness? It's just things get in the way. There's things that's blocking us getting to that.
I wouldn't necessarily make that assumption, Johnny.
Okay.
It's not the worst assumption we could make, but
Yeah, yeah, sure.
it is an assumption, right? So, I mean, I was a business coach for 25 years. That was sort of my background before FLFE. And the position we would typically start with is that we just acknowledge what is. Like, were we born with a high level of consciousness? Some of us were. Some were born very high. If you measure the level of consciousness of the saints of society, like the Jesus and the Buddha, the Krishna, Zoroaster, Moses, yeah, David Hawkins, the really high teachers, most of them were born at a high level. And then if you measure the level of consciousness of other people, they're born very low. And so it just, so there's no general truth about that I'm aware of. So that's why we go to the position of, well, let's just look at it from the point of view as it is what it is, and let's deal with what is and move forward from there.
Mm.
Because just, if you look at the results in society, if we talk about the mission of FLFE, if you want to change the world, you have to change the person. Typically change the person first, and enough positive people change the world. And if you've experienced personal suffering, and you gain freedom from that, then why not share that with the rest of your human family and help ease other people's suffering?
Mm. It's interesting how I can think of some historic examples of people who've been through some of the worst pain and suffering or injustice, and their kind of consciousness is really, really high. So I guess there's people that kind of really use as case studies in some of the work.
Well, yeah, the question is, well, one of the questions comes to my mind is, were they born high,
Mm.
or did they develop a high level of consciousness through dealing with their suffering, right?
Mm.
Like what came to mind when you mentioned that was Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for
Mm.
Meaning. He was in a concentration camp for years. Now, I could go back and try to measure his level of consciousness before, and I assume he had some education in the field before he went in, but I can't remember. But I just know the book was extraordinary, and that was a man that seemed to find peace.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good book. Big
Mhm.
lesson. Mm. Okay, yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, it makes sense. What the point you're coming from of just seeing what is now, where are they, and yeah, I'd love to know a little bit about the technology element though that you're introducing to consciousness and how that can kind of help us.
Well, the FLFE system is works in a way that's very similar to the human system.
Mm.
So we can connect with anyone, anytime, anywhere. And we know that through distant Reiki treatments, research on prayer treatments, twins, and mother and children, that instant connection anywhere, no matter where you are in the world. So that quantum association or quantum connection is something that's innate to humans, and we can experience it in that we're thinking of someone and we get a phone call a minute later,
Mm.
and they've made that quantum connection with us while they're thinking about us and while they're dialing. And then we feel them, we think of them, they're there. So we're able to do that. And the FLFE system is similar in the way that it makes a quantum association or connection with a property or around a cell phone or object. And there is a multi-piece, part system that is a physical system that the original inventors were concentrating or focusing life force energy. That's where the name came from, FLFE.
Mm.
So the original invention looked like a Tesla lab. It was high-speed alternating current flowing through towers, and it was pulling energy in those towers, and then there was one output stack, which created this very high consciousness space at the bottom of it. And when I went to see it with Clayten, at his urging, I put my hand in it. It was very tingly, very strong energy there. So that high consciousness space, because of the way the system was designed or created, it created a quantum association zone. So anything that a unique identifier that goes into that space, just like when someone's dialing you on the phone, they're thinking of you, they're looking at your phone number, that quantum association occurs. It's the same there. When an address goes into that space, that quantum association occurs, and we're able to basically that the high consciousness field that's there in that space is now in the property, and we're able to, through instructions, regulate the consciousness level, the size of the field, the conscious field, and then content in that field.
Mm.
So there's nothing that gets shipped. There's no object that you have to buy and get. It's just this same connection that we humans can do every day. Really is it's kind of the same technology, you could say, um, maybe executed in a different way.
Mm. So yeah, so interesting, and how you brought up the points of like when you're thinking of someone and then they start calling you, and then yeah, just from that kind of like interaction to the quantum, it sounds like. So little things like that, you help you. That's what the technology's doing.
Yeah, it's the same principle, Johnny.
Mm. Got you.
So if you're holding a positive thought for somebody,
Mm.
then you're supporting a high consciousness field to be around them to some degree, depending on how powerful you are and what their receptivity is. And if you're having a negative thought about somebody, then you would be, creating a low consciousness field around them to some degree.
Mm. Can that impact on the person if you're having a low conscious, like a low level of consciousness thought towards them?
Yes, it just depends how well protected they are, or
Mm.
how high their consciousness is, because a low consciousness thought has very little power, right?
Mm.
So a high conscious person, well, naturally they'll just bounce off them and they won't even notice it. Yeah.
Mm.
Now there are more powerful high consciousness or low consciousness places in the world. And in a low consciousness place, say like an old battlefield or a prison, where there was a lot of suffering. I mean, there was a lot of people in despair, anger, all the low emotions, um, and or an apartment where someone was suffering, maybe a long illness or a terrible divorce or even murder and torture and those kind of things. they all create, because we are a consciousness field, of course, and that can become stored or embedded into the crystalline structure of the property, the the concrete, the drywall, the dirt. So that then remains. There's like a historical imprint of that suffering that happened in that place. And so that has quite a bit of power when we're in, because it was repetitive and it was intense, perhaps, over and over. And so that can have a really dampening effect on our energy. It can lower our personal energy. It can allow more negative thoughts about ourselves, about others, to be present for us. In fact, in Japan, there's something called Jita Buken, which is stigmatized or defective properties, and that's where there was a major what they call a psychological defect, like a suicide or a murder. And in Japan, agents are required to disclose that because people know that if they move into that environment where it was the low consciousness field and there was thoughts of death and suicide, that will affect them personally.
Mm.
And so that's part of what what FLFE does is it clears that history that's there, because it's everywhere. I mean, we're talking not just our history in our lifetime, but previous generations of previous generations. In, like, say, in an old house, or in a place where there was a battlefield, and then it was built upon later. That negative history can still be there, and it can affect, like we said, our personal energy, the negative thoughts that we might have about ourselves, and it can also lowering your personal energy. Like if you're in despair, you just have very little energy to do anything. Very little energy to just do life, just do the things you need to do. Very little energy to envision a way out, some other way of living. So it's really, really a situation like that, if you happen to be in a really low spot, could really change the way you think about yourself and your confidence and your, how you do life.
And what kind of comes to mind for me is you can be like, suddenly you can be in a place where you're like, I don't know why, I'm just feeling a bit off, or like I'm just feeling a little bit down or something. And also around, without judgment, sometimes feeling it in certain crowds and then feeling a lot better in other crowds. So that's what's coming up for me. It sounds like that might be the catching on to the energy of the environment, the consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, humans and all animals, we have to have a sense of the safety of the environment around us, right? Just for survival. And that natural innate ability that you're talking about, Johnny, is that's you sensing a consciousness field. And the higher the field is, probably the safer you feel. And the lower the consciousness field is, that part of the reptilian brain is going to kick in, and it's going to be looking over your shoulder, double checking, making sure you have an exit out of the place. And so when you're in those low environments, self-esteem and positive a positive view of life, it's below survival and threat analysis and and those sort of things, right? So that's a very good example of a high consciousness field and a low consciousness field, just what you described.